The wind that rolled across the plains always carried a sharp edge, the kind that made the grass tremble and the gravel crunch under each step. Out here, just outside the town limits, the land felt open, quiet, and unclaimed. It was exactly why the narrator, an independent, solitary homeowner, had chosen it. No neighbors too close, no board members hovering, no fines for the height of your grass or the color of your mailbox. Just land, sky, and silence. But that illusion began cracking the day the trucks arrived. At first, the arrival of unfamiliar utility vehicles didn't seem alarming. Trucks came and went around rural land all the time, repairs, surveys, deliveries. But these ones were different. They rolled in like a convoy, polished white SUVs with magnetic badges slapped on the doors, claiming HOA security enforcement. Bold, black letters that looked official enough to fool anyone at a glance. The sight of them crawling across the boundary fence felt wrong, like an invasion disguised as authority. The narrator stood at the window, watching the vehicles idle in front of the property line. The engines hummed, sending waves of exhaust into the early afternoon air. Men in matching polos stepped out, sunglasses hiding their eyes, clipboards tucked under their arms. They walked with a manufactured confidence, the kind used by people who needed to appear important. There was no HOA here, never had been. That was the whole point of buying land outside the development zone. But as the narrator watched them inspect the boundary markers and gesture toward the house, a cold realization began to form. Someone nearby had decided that this land, despite being outside their jurisdiction, was somehow theirs to control. Rumors had spread over the years about the neighboring subdivision's HOA, the strict rules, the inflated fines, the invasive, compliance checks. They treated their neighborhood like a private kingdom, and anyone too close to their borders like an inconvenience. And with the subdivision expanding, swallowing more farmland every year, they had grown bolder. Some said they tried annexing properties without permission. Others said the board president believed she had authority over the entire valley. Watching the fake security stroll around like predators scouting territory, the narrator finally understood why the neighbors called them the Empire. The next morning came with even worse surprises. Yellow stakes appeared overnight along the dirt path, marking imaginary HOA perimeter boundaries. Laminated notices were zip-tied to the fence, each stamped with the same counterfeit security seal. They listed rules, absurd ones, about lawn maintenance, noise curfews, vehicle visibility, and even restrictions on livestock. The narrator's goats, grazing peacefully near the fence, apparently violated HOA Code 7.6b. The papers threatened escalating fines, enforcement visits, and legal action. None of it was legitimate. None of it had any legal standing. But the aggressive confidence behind it showed one thing clearly: this wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a hostile takeover attempt. As the sun rose higher, the fake security returned. They drove slower this time, as if patrolling. Their radios crackled with staged chatter, full of empty jargon. The narrator stayed back, hidden behind the dusty curtains, documenting everything. Every badge, every paper, every intrusion. Something about the whole display felt theatrical, like an intimidation performance designed to scare someone into compliance. But fear wasn't the narrator's response. Instead, something else took root, something sharper than the wind sweeping across the land. A sense of defiance. A quiet understanding that this was a test. If they succeeded here, they'd do it to others. If they weren't stopped, their reach would only grow. The narrator stepped outside only after the vehicles were gone. The laminated notices fluttered in the breeze. The goats nudged one of them. With mild annoyance. The absurdity would have been laughable if it didn't carry such an unsettling undertone. The subdivision's board was trying to push the illusion of power so forcefully that they expected people to fold without question. And maybe some did. Maybe that was why they felt bold enough to challenge land they had no ownership of. Footprints and tire tracks crisscrossed the edge of the property. Deep grooves in the soil showed where one of the SUVs had driven partially onto the land. The narrator photographed everything: angles, distances, timestamps. Not just because it might be needed later, but because every detail told a story of people pretending to be officers of authority. Later, word came from a nearby rancher. He'd heard from someone inside the subdivision that the HOA board president, a woman infamous for micromanaging everything from flower beds to window blinds, believed the narrator's land should rightfully fall under their governance. She was the type who measured her worth by the territory she controlled, and this land, untouched and independent, bothered her. She had apparently formed her own private enforcement group, hiring off-duty store security guards and giving them cheap uniforms to look official. That revelation only fueled the narrator's resolve. As dusk settled that evening, the land felt different. Shadows stretched long across the ground, the air cooling rapidly. But instead of the usual peace, there was tension. The narrator moved through the property slowly, checking the perimeter, making mental notes. If the fake security planned to escalate, it needed to be met with preparation. The house, quiet and dimly lit, became a planning ground. Maps came out. Property documents were laid across the table. Boundaries were confirmed, legal descriptions verified. The subdivision had no power here, not legally, not logically. But people abusing authority rarely cared about limits. As night deepened, headlights appeared in the distance again. Another sweep. Another slow roll past the fence line, lights briefly shining toward the windows before disappearing down the road. They were testing reactions, probing for weakness. But the narrator simply watched, calm and steady, understanding something important. They had made their first move. Now the real fight over the land, and over control, was beginning. The next morning rose with a strange stillness, the kind that usually arrived before a storm. The land looked the same: wide stretches of earth, the familiar sway of dry grass, the quiet bleating of goats wandering lazily across the property, but the feeling that hung in the air was different. It felt watched. Observed. Marked. It didn't take long before the reason became clear. A new structure appeared at the edge of the subdivision road, a folding table beneath a pop-up canopy, set up like some kind of makeshift checkpoint. An oversized banner labeled HOA Security Command Post flapped wildly in the wind, its corners barely held down by rocks. Plastic chairs were arranged in a crooked semicircle. A cheap walkie-talkie sat on the table beside a clipboard full of blank forms, giving the illusion of actual organization. None of it looked official. But all of it was designed to intimidate. By the time the narrator noticed it, the so-called security team was already busy. They stood by the table with coffee cups in hand, scanning the narrator's property like officers on surveillance duty. One pointed toward the house as if giving an update. Another wrote something down on his clipboard with theatrical seriousness. It was clear they wanted to be seen, wanted their presence to be unmistakable. Not long after, word spread again through the nearby ranchers. This time the update carried a sharper edge. The subdivision's infamous HOA board president wasn't happy that her first attempt hadn't yielded fear or compliance. Instead of backing off, she had doubled down. She told residents that the narrator's land was disrupting the aesthetic integrity of the community, despite the fact that the narrator didn't live in the community at all. She complained about unregulated livestock, non-standard fencing, and unauthorized structures, none of which fell under her jurisdiction. Yet she insisted the land was being annexed for the greater good. The ranchers laughed when they repeated her words, but the situation itself wasn't funny. The president was the kind of person who believed rules existed only to give her power. And people like that never stopped pushing, not until they hit an unmovable wall. Over the next few days, the escalation continued like clockwork. Strangers, clearly members of the subdivision, began driving by slowly, pretending to be out for casual rides. Their windows rolled down just enough to peer across the property as they passed. Some even paused long enough to take photos, perhaps for the HOA's documentation. The subdivision's online forum posted warnings about uncooperative property owners in the area. They painted the narrator as someone refusing to follow community guidelines, even though the narrator wasn't part of their community at all. But the biggest escalation came on the fourth day. In the early hours of the morning, long before sunrise colored the horizon, bright lights flickered across the bedroom window. Not headlights, spotlights. Artificial beams sweeping across the property like searchlights in a prison yard. They moved slowly, methodically, illuminating fences, animals, and the facade of the house. The goat stirred nervously, and the wind seemed to freeze for a moment as if holding its breath. By the time the narrator reached the window, the fake security convoy was back, 3 SUVs parked just beyond the property line. The men stood outside with handheld spotlights, scanning every inch of the land as if hunting for evidence. The beams moved deliberately, pausing on the house for longer than necessary, making the intrusion unmistakably personal. The narrator documented everything again, every movement, every timestamp, every light flickering across the windows. If they wanted this to be a battle of intimidation, they would soon learn it wasn't one they could win. Intimidation only worked when the target felt powerless. Shortly after sunrise, the convoy disappeared. But the effects lingered. Dust hung in the air like smoke, and the ground bore deep marks from where the SUVs had stopped repeatedly over the last few days. The narrator knew they weren't finished. Something bigger was coming. It arrived just after noon. A single SUV pulled up near the edge of the subdivision road. Its doors opened with an almost ceremonial slowness. Out stepped a woman dressed in a crisp blazer, heels sinking slightly into the dirt. Her hair was styled with the kind of precision that suggested she spent more time controlling her appearance than most people spent controlling their entire lives. Even from a distance, her posture radiated entitlement. Every movement said she believed she owned this land, the valley, and the air around it. The HOA president. She strutted toward the boundary line like it was a throne she intended to reclaim. Her security officers trailed behind her in a staggered line, clearly trying to mimic professional formation. They carried more clipboards today, and one even held a camera, snapping photos aggressively as if capturing evidence of a criminal enterprise. The president paused at the property line, tapping her foot impatiently, staring at the house with a mix of annoyance and self-importance. She pointed toward the barn. Then the fence. Then the goats. The guard scribbled notes with frantic obedience. It was clear she was narrating a list of violations that didn't apply to this land, but that didn't matter to her. In her mind, authority came from confidence, not legality. The narrator remained inside, watching from behind the curtains. This wasn't the moment to confront her. Not yet. Confrontations were strongest when timed, not rushed. Instead, the narrator filmed everything, documenting her intrusion and every move she made. Evidence was building into a mountain, and eventually that mountain would collapse onto her entire scheme. The president stayed. For nearly an hour, inspecting, pointing, recording, and gesturing like a queen surveying disputed territory. When she finally left, her face betrayed something telling: frustration. The narrator hadn't reacted. She wanted a scene, a confrontation, a moment to exert dominance. Instead, she was met with silence, and nothing irritated an authoritarian more than being denied an audience. But her silence backfired. That evening, a notice appeared on the fence, bolder and more aggressive than any before. This one claimed, "Final warning, HOA enforcement action imminent." It was printed in all caps, stamped repeatedly with the fake security logo. It listed fines totaling thousands of dollars and threatened mandatory property inspections. It was clear now, the president believed she owned this land, and she intended to prove it by force. What she didn't know was that the narrator had already prepared something even stronger than resistance, something legal, powerful, and unavoidable. And soon it would turn the entire situation against her. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of dry earth and wild grass. It felt deceptively calm, but the tension of the previous days lingered like a low hum in every corner of the property. The narrator moved deliberately across the land, boots crunching against gravel and dirt. Every step was measured. Every glance scanned the horizon. After days of intrusion, intimidation, and fake security theatrics, the narrator knew that today marked a turning point. The first sign came from the road. The subdivision vehicles were arriving, fewer in number than before, but moving with exaggerated caution. Their tires kicked up dust, but no lights flashed. No clipboards waved. There was hesitation now, as if the board members knew they might be stepping into territory they hadn't fully considered. Inside the house, the narrator had already made preparations. Legal documents were laid out across the table, each one proving ownership, boundary lines, and full compliance with local regulations. Recorded footage of every fake security patrol, every laminated notice, every violation attempt was catalogued. Every step the HOA president had taken over the last week had been captured, time-stamped, and saved. This wasn't just documentation, it was armor. By mid-morning, the HOA president herself appeared, as if drawn to the property like a magnet. She stepped from her vehicle with the same calculated confidence, heels sinking slightly into the dirt, clipboard in hand, ready to intimidate once more. The narrator, however, met her gaze from the window, calm and unwavering. The contrast was stark, authority versus rightful ownership, arrogance versus preparation. She approached the property line, and the guards followed reluctantly behind, unsure for the first time if their presence held any weight. This time, the president didn't point or gesture, she simply stared, scanning the house, the fence, the barn, as if trying to convince herself that her presence here mattered. She wanted a reaction. But the narrator remained inside, poised, silent, unflinching. Then it began. A letter was delivered by certified mail, no more intimidation tactics, no more shadowy patrols. The HOA president received legal notice that any further intrusion, harassment, or attempts to enforce rules on the narrator's property would be considered trespassing and harassment under state law. It included references to local ordinances, property rights, and evidence of the president's previous attempts to enforce rules on non-member properties. The documentation was overwhelming. Photos, video, timestamps, and witness statements from nearby ranchers corroborating every incursion. The president's face changed the moment she realized what was happening. Confidence faltered. The smug expression that had carried her through previous days cracked, replaced by frustration, disbelief, and the faintest hint of panic. She had attempted to assert control over land that was never hers, relying on fake security, bluffs, and intimidation tactics, but now she faced the tangible weight of law and evidence stacked against her. Her guards shifted uneasily, unsure how to respond. Some glanced at one another, silently questioning the legitimacy of the tasks they had been given. The president, usually quick to command, froze. The authority she had claimed with such certainty was now hollow. The narrator's meticulous preparation had turned the power dynamic on its head, the predator had become prey. The confrontation didn't need words. It unfolded in silence. The HOA president stepped back from the property line, scanning the boundary one last time. Her eyes flicked briefly toward the window where the narrator observed calmly, then downward to the legal documents now resting in clear view. For the first time, her presence held no weight, no leverage, no authority. The facade of power crumbled. By the afternoon, the president and her team retreated. Their vehicles disappeared down the road, kicking up dust but leaving no further signs of intrusion. The fake security, once bold and overbearing, no longer dared patrol the property. The yellow stakes, laminated notices, and command posts were ignored, their power nullified by the simple truth: this land belonged to the narrator, and no HOA, no board, and no fabricated enforcement could change that fact. The narrator stepped outside as the sun began to lower on the horizon. The wind swept across the open fields, carrying away the lingering tension. The goats grazed peacefully, unbothered by the events of the past week. The land looked just as it had before the fake security arrived, but the victory felt profound. It wasn't just about property, it was about standing firm, documenting everything, and refusing to be intimidated by someone else's delusions of control. Nearby ranchers who had followed the saga celebrated in quiet solidarity. They knew how far the HOA president had overstepped, and they marveled at the narrator's resilience. Word spread through the valley of the failed takeover attempt, and it became a cautionary tale about the limits of authority, the importance of preparation, and the risks of underestimating someone who knew their rights. By nightfall, the property was quiet again. Stars sparkled above like scattered diamonds, the wind whispered through the grass, and the house sat calmly, as if untouched by conflict. The narrator moved through the rooms one last time, feeling the satisfaction of victory, not loud or showy, but steady and complete. The fake security would not return. The HOA president had learned, in the most humiliating way possible, that power is meaningless without legitimacy. And as darkness fell, there was a quiet certainty: the land, once threatened, was finally free. Free from fabricated authority, free from intimidation, and free from those who believed control could be taken by bluster alone. The narrator knew that vigilance would always be necessary. People who abuse power rarely disappear entirely, but for now, the battle was won. The valley returned to its natural rhythm. The goats continued to graze, the wind swept freely across the open fields, and the house stood firm as a symbol of resilience. And in that silence, in that unbroken space, the narrator understood a truth that no fake security could ever alter: property, law, and integrity are stronger than fear, and no one, not even an overzealous HOA, can rewrite reality. The confrontation was over, but the story of the land, its boundaries, and its rightful owner would live on, whispered by the wind and remembered by those who witnessed it. And while the HOA president nursed her bruised ego and reconsidered the limits of her control, the narrator could finally walk the property without fear, confident that some battles are won not with anger, but with preparation, patience, and persistence. The saga concludes. The land is safe, the HOA president thwarted, and the narrator victorious.